On a cold October morning in 1863, three soldiers are locked in a tent with a single order: eat nothing but army biscuit day after day until the body breaks. This isn't punishment. It's science. And the man giving that order is about to discover something that will change forever what an entire nation puts on its plate. While cannons thunder just a few miles away, this doctor walks between cots packed with soldiers who never even saw the enemy up close. They're dying from the inside out, victims of a disease no one can explain. And his theory sounds almost heretical for the time. Maybe the problem isn't germs. Maybe it's the fork. To prove his own hunch, he does something unthinkable. He turns his own body into a lab, living for weeks at a time on nothing but a single food, writing down every dizzy spell, every ache, every symptom in a notebook that would become, without him realizing it, the blueprint for an obsession. What starts as an experiment turns into something close to religion. Years after the war, crowds cross oceans just to sit at this man's table and try the same cure, convinced that a plate of ground beef and a glass of warm water can slim the body, brighten the skin, and hand back the energy of childhood to anyone willing to pay the price. But the strangest part of this story hasn't even happened yet, because decades later, that same dish resurfaces, unrecognizable and completely tamed, on a plastic tray in the cafeteria of practically every American school, with not a single kid ever suspecting the dark origin of what was sitting on their fork. This is the story of Salisbury steak. Welcome to Savoring History, the channel where we dig up the wild stories hiding behind the most ordinary food on our table. And what I'm bringing you today easily makes the top 3 we've ever covered. Because let's be honest, when someone says Salisbury steak, nobody pictures war and desperation. They picture TV dinners, a metal tray, a bland school lunch. But behind that hamburger in disguise is an obsessed doctor, an army being wiped out by dysentery, and one of the first fad diets in American history. After today, I promise you, you'll never look at ground beef the same way again. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who loves uncovering the bizarre backstory behind everyday food, this channel was made for you. So hit subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps Savoring History keep going and keep bringing you these deep dives into food history. Drop a like too. That's literally what tells YouTube to put this in front of more people who'd love this story just as much as you do. And since we're here, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country and city in the comments. I read every single one. And it's always a little surreal seeing how many corners of the planet this channel reaches, all to hear about ground beef with a darker past than you'd expect. All right, let's get into how a wartime remedy turned, decades later, into the most nostalgic dish on the American school lunch tray. Our main character has a name: Dr. James Henry Salisbury, and the label he originally gave his own creation was, honestly, disgusting. Muscle pulp of beef. Thank God it eventually became just Salisbury steak. The dish was born as a treatment for the diseases tearing through the Union Army, dysentery above all. The original recipe was simple: lean beef, stripped of sinew and connective tissue, chopped into a pulp that couldn't be packed too tightly. Otherwise, it tasted livery. Formed into patties about 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick. Broiled slowly, away from flame and smoke. Only butter, salt, and pepper allowed. On the plate, it could take Worcestershire sauce, mustard, horseradish, or lemon. Not all that different from the Salisbury steak we know today. Just a lot more austere. But to understand why a doctor landed on this exact recipe, we need to rewind to before the war even started, because the origin of this story is even stranger than the dish itself. In the years leading up to the conflict, Salisbury became fascinated with diseases of the gut. This was the dawn of germ theory, and even though he was an early believer in it, there was barely any effective treatment for most of these illnesses. We're talking about a time when washing your hands before surgery was still considered a cutting-edge idea. Yes, really. With no answers on the medical side, he bet everything on diet. The challenge was figuring out, inside a varied diet, exactly which food caused which symptom. His solution was radical. Live alone, on a single food at a time, and log everything that happened to his own body. He started with baked beans. Within 3 days, in his own words, he began to see the light. He became severely gassy and constipated, dizzy, with ringing ears, tingling limbs, and completely unfit for any mental work. Worst possible start to an experiment, you'd think. But according to him, the effects turned positive over time. And that's when things escalated. He paid 6 men to live exclusively on beans too. The following year, he repeated the process with asparagus, corn, rice, potatoes, beets, turnips, and tapioca, always on different people. It was while testing lean beef that he believed he'd found the perfect food, maximum nourishment with minimum digestive effort. The muscle pulp of beef. The Civil War handed Salisbury something no other researcher of the era had: access to a massive number of patients in Union hospitals. And what he saw there was alarming. More soldiers dying of dysentery and diarrhea than of gunshot wounds. Even as a believer in germ theory, he still hadn't connected the dots between germs, dirty water, and contaminated food. What he saw was something else entirely, that it was the food itself causing the damage. And in his mind, the biggest villain was hardtack, that rock-hard army biscuit soldiers carried because cooked meat wouldn't survive more than a few days on the march. To prove his point, he put 3 men on an exclusive diet of hardtack, with nothing but water and a shot of whiskey at lunch and dinner. Over the following month, he cataloged, in fairly graphic detail, these men's bathroom habits, or rather, the complete lack of them. At the same time, he tested other foods on other soldiers. Peas and beets caused problems within days. Bread, rice, and tapioca could take up to 45 days to cause trouble. And there was one group of foods that, according to him, never caused any side effects at all: beef and mutton. Some of these men stayed on that exclusive diet for 3 or 4 years before ever reintroducing bread and vegetables. And that's how the muscle pulp of beef became one of the most widely used treatments for dysentery during the war. If the story stopped there, it would already be bizarre enough. But Salisbury didn't stop. Ordens, he went deeper and deeper into the idea that a diet built almost entirely on meat was the right path for any human being. Fruits and vegetables, in his view, should make up no more than 1/3 of your diet. Preferably none at all, because raw vegetables produced noxious gases in the body that, over time, could cause heart failure, tumors, even mental illness. He even pointed to the shape of human teeth as physical proof that we were built to eat meat. By the 1880s, the man was basically a mashup of Dr. Atkins and a modern-day meat influencer, nearly a century before either term existed. A book on the subject came out in 1888. It wasn't a runaway hit until one of his followers, British author Elma Stewart, published an account claiming Salisbury's diet had cured an illness she'd carried for 9 years. That went viral, in the literal sense by 19th century standards. and the Salisbury name spread across the entire English-speaking world almost overnight. His practice in New York became a global destination. People traveling from every corner of the world just to eat his meat pulp and drink hot water under his watchful supervision. And as always happens when fame outruns evidence, the claims kept getting bolder. Glowing skin, childlike energy, even more physical attractiveness. That's when part of the press started getting suspicious. One newspaper ran a piece calling his practice a nest of cranks, describing his patients as hollow-eyed people convinced they were being cured. But that was clearly the minority opinion, because meanwhile, Salisbury steak was becoming a nationwide craze, far beyond doctors' offices. It was in 1890 that the muscle pulp of beef got its defining rebrand. Newspapers started printing recipes for Salisbury steak, aimed at the general public. Those early versions were as plain as it gets: ground meat, maybe a little flour, salt, pepper, and butter. They usually ran right alongside recipes for Hamburg steak, the more seasoned version with onion, sage, and thyme, the direct ancestor of the hamburger we know today. Over the following decades, the recipes got bolder. One version from San Francisco, around 1910, included onion juice, came with mashed potatoes and a horseradish cream sauce. And the strangest detail of all, each steak was topped with a baked banana. I couldn't find any record of that combination catching on anywhere else. Probably for the best. Interestingly, the dish also showed up on breakfast menus around the turn of the century, unthinkable today. But it was World War I that gave the name its final push. When the United States went to war with Germany, a wave of forced patriotism renamed a bunch of foods associated with the enemy. Hamburg steak became Salisbury steak. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. Bratwurst became Liberty sausage. Yes, that really happened. And even though the dish was already a national habit, its creator was forgotten fast. Just 5 years after Salisbury's death, a newspaper credited the dish's creation to a completely different doctor. Over the following decades, it was common to see stories crediting the name to a town called Salisbury, either in England or in North Carolina. Never to the actual doctor. Decades later, another doctor, Frank McCoy, published an article in hundreds of American newspapers trying to revive the original formula as a cure for rheumatism and a kidney condition. The plan: for 1 week, 3 meals a day of half a pound of Salisbury steak with all the celery or tomato you wanted, nothing else. Half an hour before each meal, drink a pint of warm water. And as a bonus, 2 enemas a day. Strangely enough, it didn't catch on. Salisbury steak started losing ground once hamburgers made their big comeback around the mid-20th century. It quickly became shorthand for an old-fashioned dish, a leftover from a bygone Victorian era nobody wanted on the menu anymore. What brought it back was a completely different invention: the TV dinner. It became a craze soon after it launched. And before long, Salisbury steak was one of the most popular options inside those frozen trays. That's exactly when it also became a fixture on the American school lunch menu. The same dish that a century earlier had been born as a wartime remedy was now Tuesday's lunch for millions of kids who'd never heard of James Henry Salisbury. And that's exactly the version I want to recreate today. The one pulled from the official large-scale recipe manual used by American schools for decades. The problem is, those recipes were built to feed 50, sometimes 100 students at once. So I scaled it down to about 12 servings. You'll need roughly 2 pounds of ground beef, 3 ounces of rolled oats, 1 egg, a 1/4 cup of water, a 1/4 cup of beef stock, 2 tablespoons of non-fat dry milk, 2 tablespoons of dehydrated onion, 1 tablespoon of dried parsley, and half a teaspoon of black pepper. Notice there's one obvious ingredient missing here: salt. The original recipe genuinely doesn't call for any, just whatever comes from the beef stock. I'm going to follow it as written, for the sake of historical accuracy. But I won't judge you one bit for adding a couple of teaspoons of salt to your own version. To put it together, mash the ground beef in a bowl and work in the dry seasonings: pepper, parsley, and dehydrated onion. Add the egg and mix well. Then add the oats a little at a time, followed by the dry milk, and finally the water and beef stock, mixing just until combined. Don't overwork it or the meat turns tough. Portion the mixture into roughly 1/3 cup patties and shape them into flattened ovals, the classic school tray look. Bake at 350 for 25 minutes. While the patties bake, you can get the gravy going, because Salisbury steak without sauce simply doesn't exist. The classic school version is a brown gravy. Melt 2 tablespoons of butter in a saucepan. Add about 1/4 cup of flour and stir until you've got a dry roux. Cook over medium heat, stirring often until golden, about 8 minutes. Add the beef stock in slowly, whisking the roux in as you go. Season with half a teaspoon of onion powder and a pinch of black or white pepper. Bring it to a boil, then lower the heat and simmer for 6 to 8 minutes, until it's thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. By the time you serve it, the gravy will naturally start to set a little on top of the steak as it cools. And for anyone who grew up eating this in school, that's exactly how it's supposed to be. The result is a simple, honest dish. A little bland eaten plain, practically begging for an extra pinch of salt, but with a flavor that pulls up memories of recess and metal trays. The oats barely register in the final result. They play a quiet supporting role, not the lead. It's the kind of food that won't impress anyone on the first bite, but carries decades of nostalgia in every bite after that. And it's almost ironic to think about. A dish this ordinary, this unassuming at first glance, hiding an origin this dramatic. An obsessed doctor, testing extreme diets on himself and on dying soldiers, long before becoming shorthand for a plastic lunch tray. At the end of the day, that's the whole story. A wartime remedy that turned into a cult, then a fad diet, then a hamburger in disguise, until it landed, decades later, on the most nostalgic tray of our childhood. Not a single kid ever knew what they were really eating, and maybe that's for the best. If this story got you the way it got me while I was researching it, drop a like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to Savoring History, because this wasn't even the strangest story I've told on this channel, and you won't want to miss the next one. See you then.